Billionaire curses out black maid for entering his office. Minutes later, she saves his life. Clara moved through the Parker estate like a shadow, quiet, careful, invisible. At 62, she knew better than to disturb a man like Mr. Parker, the cold, sharp billionaire who barked more than he spoke. But that day, she noticed something. His blood pressure pills were still on the kitchen counter. She hesitated, then gently stepped into his study to bring them. "What are you doing in here?" he exploded. "Get out now." Before she could answer, he stumbled. His face went pale. One hand clutched his chest. The pill bottle dropped from Clara's hand as instinct took over. She ran to him, not as a maid, but as someone who had seen this before. Someone who had once lost the man she loved to the same silent thief. "Where are you watching from today?" Speech balloon. Say hello in the comments. Clara's journey is just beginning. Clara Johnson had been working at the Parker estate for just under a year, though you wouldn't know it from the way she slipped through its marble halls. She was the kind of woman who never made a fuss. Never left a dish unwashed. Never raised her voice, even when spoken to like she didn't belong. And in that house, that happened more often than not. Mr. Charles Parker III was a man of habits. Widowed 5 years earlier, he kept to his office most days, buried in old financial reports and rare books. Once the head of a vast logistics empire, Charles had retired early after a stroke took half his vision and all his patience. He had money, too much of it, but very little warmth. Especially not for those he thought beneath him. Clara had learned that early on. The first week she'd started, she'd greeted him kindly while placing fresh linen in the upstairs closet. He hadn't looked up from his chair. "I don't need conversation. Just clean the place," he'd said. So she had. Quietly. Efficiently. She wasn't there for praise anyway. She was there because rent in the city had gone up again, and Social Security didn't stretch like it used to. Because her granddaughter, little Amaya, had dreams of becoming a teacher, and Clara had promised to help with tuition when the time came. Because staying busy kept her from thinking about nights when Harold's side of the bed was cold, and had been for over 20 years. Harold. He was the reason Clara had recognized the signs so quickly that day. When she'd stepped into that study, she wasn't trying to intrude. The small orange bottle had been sitting on the counter, forgotten, and she knew the man was on strict instructions to take it after lunch. He was often too proud, or too forgetful, to do what the doctors told him. She'd seen it before in Harold. The stubbornness. The denial. The slow decline. That morning, Mr. Parker had looked pale. His breathing shallow. Clara had noticed, because noticing was what women like her did. Always scanning, always adjusting. But when she crossed into the study to gently place the medication on his desk, it was like stepping on broken glass. He snapped. "What are you doing in here?" he'd roared, standing up too fast. "I told you, this room is off limits. Get out now." His voice cracked with age and anger. Clara froze, murmured an apology, and began to back away. But in that instant, his face went slack. His lips parted as if to speak again, but no sound came. His hand trembled mid-air. Then he fell. No one else was in the house. Clara didn't think. She ran to his side, kneeling on that rich mahogany floor, her heart pounding like it hadn't in years. "Mr. Parker, can you hear me?" There was no answer. His body was heavy, lifeless. One side drooped. His breathing was shallow, irregular. The same gasping struggle she'd once heard in the hospital room, when Harold clutched his chest and the monitors blared. She hadn't known what to do back then. She hadn't known CPR. But she'd learned. Oh, she'd learned. After Harold's death, she'd volunteered at the community health center. Spent Saturdays training with younger nurses and EMTs, learning how to respond in an emergency. "I wasn't fast enough for my husband," she once told the director. "But I won't be slow again." And now here she was, her knees pressing into expensive carpet, the man who'd never once said thank you lying unconscious in front of her. She checked his pulse. Weak, but there. She tilted his head, cleared his airway. Her hands moved with quiet purpose, remembering every step. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. Over and over again. Come on, come back, she whispered. Somewhere in the room, the antique clock ticked on, indifferent. Finally, a groan. Then, another. Mr. Parker's eyes fluttered open. His first word was a hoarse, "What?" "You had a heart episode," Clara said gently. "Help is on the way." She'd called 911 while working on him, never letting go. Her voice had been calm, clear. She'd even given the paramedics the gate code. They would be there in minutes. For the first time, Charles Parker looked up at her and didn't see a maid. He saw something else. A woman with steady hands and trembling eyes. A woman who had just given him back something he hadn't even known he was about to lose. Life. He tried to speak again, but she shook her head. "Don't try right now. Save your strength." The ambulance sirens began to wail in the distance, slicing through the cold afternoon air. Clara sat beside him on the floor, pressing a handkerchief into his palm. And in that quiet moment, something shifted. Not with words, but with presence. The man who barked. The woman who bowed her head. Now both sat on the same floor, sharing the same breath of silence between heartbeat and grace. The hospital room smelled like bleach and blooming lilies, the kind volunteers placed at the front desk each morning, hoping to soften the sharpness of illness. Charles Parker lay there, awake but wordless, staring at the textured ceiling as machines beeped softly beside him. Clara hadn't expected to be called. She'd stayed back, quietly folding fresh towels in the Parker laundry room when the phone rang. The butler, who rarely called her directly, said the old man had asked for her. Not his lawyer. Not his cousin across town. Her. She didn't rush, but she didn't hesitate either. When Clara entered the room, Charles turned his head slightly. His eyes weren't quite as hard now, though still guarded. A man used to controlling every aspect of his world rarely softened easily. "You came," he said, voice low and gravelly. "I did." They sat in silence for a moment. "You saved my life," he added, more statement than gratitude. "I didn't do it for thanks," she replied gently. "You needed help." He nodded slowly, his hands resting weakly on the blanket. "I don't remember much. Just pain. And your face. You were calm." "I've seen it before," she said, folding her hands in her lap. And just like that, the past drifted into the room. Clara told him, not everything, but just enough. About Harold, her late husband. About the day she'd lost him, right there in their living room while waiting for an ambulance that came too late. About how that moment broke her, and rebuilt her. "I didn't know how to help him," she whispered, voice steady. "So afterward, I made sure I'd never feel that helpless again." She paused, then added, "That's why I knew what to do for you." Charles shifted slightly, visibly uncomfortable in the way people are when truth doesn't fit their pride. "No one's ever told me no before," he murmured. "Never corrected me. You should have been scared to step in." "I was," she admitted. "But saving a life is more important than saving my job." Those words lingered in the air. For the first time in years, maybe decades, Charles Parker felt something unfamiliar, shame. He'd built towers out of steel and money, but not once had he paused to see the people holding up his world. Not the driver who knew his schedule better than his assistant. Not the housekeeper who remembered to water his wife's favorite fern. And certainly not Clara, whose quiet competence had once irritated him, only because she never asked for attention. "You said your husband passed?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Heart attack. He was only 59. Charles's eyes lowered. "I'm sorry." "Thank you," she replied, and she meant it. Not just for the words, but for the shift she saw in his posture, like something small had melted around his shoulders. A nurse came in to check his vitals. Clara stood to leave, but Charles reached out, just slightly. "You don't have to go yet." Clara sat again. And then, something surprising happened. He began to talk. About his late wife, Margaret. About her laugh, and the way she used to play jazz piano on Sunday mornings before brunch. About how the house had gone silent after she died, and he'd filled it with business meetings and locked doors instead of music. She was the only person who ever saw through me, he said. After she passed, I didn't want to be seen at all. Clara listened, offering no advice. Just presence. Later that evening, back at the estate, Charles made a call. Not to his doctor, not to his attorney, but to his butler. He gave one simple instruction: please invite Clara to dinner when I return. The twist came a few days later. Clara was going through old drawers in the music room, one of the few untouched parts of the house. A faded photograph slipped from a folder, a woman seated at a piano, laughing mid-note. Margaret Parker. But it wasn't just the woman in the photo that caught Clara's breath, it was what sat atop the piano. A familiar folder. Stamped with a community health seal. Her old CPR training manual. Suddenly, memories rushed back. Years ago, during her volunteering days, a frail woman had come in, elegant, silver-haired, eager to learn despite arthritis in her hands. Clara had coached her personally, adapting techniques for her condition. The woman had hugged her afterward, thanking her for making her feel useful again. She hadn't realized then. That woman was Margaret Parker. That meant, indirectly, Margaret had brought CPR into their home. Had trained because of Clara. And now, Clara had used that very skill to save Margaret's husband. If this moment touched your heart, please give this story a thumbs up like. The sun had barely risen when Clara returned to the Parker estate. The house looked the same, cold stone, tall windows, trimmed hedges, but it felt different now. Lighter somehow. As if something invisible had shifted inside its walls. She paused at the entryway, her hand on the brass doorknob, unsure whether she was returning as a maid, or something else. Inside, the butler gave her a quiet nod. "Mr. Parker is waiting for you in the garden room," he said, almost respectfully. That was new. Clara walked past rooms she had cleaned 100 times. Past the parlor where Margaret's portrait still hung. Past the hallway where she once cried silently after being called invisible. Each step forward was a little less heavy. She found Charles seated by the tall windows, sunlight cutting across his gray suit. He looked older somehow, not weaker, but more human. He gestured to the seat across from him. "Clara, thank you for coming." She sat, smoothing her skirt. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said. "And remembering." Clara said nothing, allowing space. "I've treated people poorly. 4 years. Not just you. My staff, my son, even my late wife when she tried to tell me I was shutting the world out." He looked down at his hands. "You reminded me what it means to be cared for without asking. And that shook me." She gave a small smile. "People change when they're ready. Some need a storm first." Charles chuckled softly. "You've got a way with words." Just then, a knock at the garden door interrupted them. A young woman stepped in, early 30s, with warm brown eyes and tightly coiled curls. She wore a red cardigan and held a slim leather portfolio under her arm. "Amaya." Clara stood up, surprised. "Baby, what are you doing here?" Amaya smiled. "Grandma, I didn't mean to barge in. Mr. Parker. He invited me." Charles stood slowly, extending a hand. "I did. Clara told me about your teaching dreams. Your scholarship interviews. And how proud she is." Amaya shook his hand, a bit confused. "I wanted to thank your grandmother," he continued. "But I also wanted to offer you something. A grant. Full tuition. All 4 years." Clara gasped. "Mr. Parker, that's too much." "No," he said, firm but gentle. "It's not enough. I have more than I need. And it's time I used it for something good. Something real." Tears welled up in Clara's eyes. "I couldn't save my wife," he said softly. "But maybe, with your help, I can honor her. She wanted to start a foundation for education before she passed. "Would you help me start it, Clara? In Margaret's name." She nodded, hand to her mouth. I would." It wasn't a grand gesture of forgiveness. It wasn't charity. It was something deeper, a chance to rebuild. Later that evening, as Clara sat with Amaya under the same magnolia tree she used to sweep around, her granddaughter leaned over. "You always told me," Amaya said, "that grace isn't loud. It just shows up. Like you did that day." Clara smiled. Sometimes, child, grace walks through a closed door and still finds its way in. And somewhere, in the same house where silence once ruled, laughter returned. Weeks passed. The Parker estate, once so still, began to stir with unfamiliar life. The air no longer carried just the scent of waxed floors and polished silver. Now it held the warmth of fresh-baked bread Clara had started making on Sundays, just like she used to for her church potlucks back in South Carolina. Mr. Parker, still recovering, had taken to joining her in the sunroom each afternoon. Not for command, not for scolding, just to talk. Sometimes about Margaret. Sometimes about nothing at all. But always with a gentleness Clara never thought she'd see from him. One morning, Charles wheeled himself into the drawing room and handed Clara a box. "These are Margaret's journals," he said. "I think she'd want you to have them." Clara opened the lid carefully. The handwriting was delicate, looping across soft yellow pages. Notes about music, about grief, about joy. And one entry, dated just a year before Margaret died, made Clara pause. "Today Clara taught me CPR," she said. "You may never need it, but you'll be glad you knew it if you do." I never told her, but that made me feel powerful, useful, seen. I hope one day I can make someone else feel that way too. Clara closed the journal, overcome. "She never told me she wrote about me," she whispered. "She told me you were the only person in this house who ever looked her in the eye without fear," Charles replied. "I didn't understand that then. I do now." Later that week, the house hosted something it never had before, a gathering of educators, health workers, and local black leaders. Charles, still in a wheelchair but more upright than ever, introduced the Margaret Parker Community Foundation. Its mission, to fund emergency health training and educational scholarships for underserved communities, beginning with Amaya as its first ambassador. Clara stood off to the side, her hands folded, watching. One of the women approached her. "You must be Clara. I've heard your name a dozen times tonight." "Oh. I didn't know I was being talked about," Clara replied modestly. The woman smiled. "You're not being talked about. You're being honored." Clara looked around, at the music room lit with warm string lights, at portraits that now included a framed photo of Margaret at the CPR seminar, and at Charles, smiling gently as he watched Amaya give her first speech. It was more than she ever imagined. Back in the kitchen, she found a note taped to the fridge, from Charles. "Clara, I once thought I was saving face by barking orders and building walls. Turns out, you were the one saving lives. Thank you. For the CPR. For the courage. For coming back through that door. Yours with deepest respect, C." She held the note in her palm for a long time before placing it in her apron. The house was still grand. But it no longer loomed. It breathed. That night, as she stepped outside and looked up at the stars, Clara whispered to herself, "You were right, Harold. Sometimes people do change. Sometimes, they just need to be seen." If you've been following this story, and it's touched your heart, Glowing Star subscribe for more stories like this, rooted in real grace and quiet courage. Spring came softly to the Parker estate, not with fanfare, but with small kindnesses. Green creeping back into the hedges, sunlight lasting just a little longer on the windowsills, and birds returning to perch where silence once ruled. Clara stood under the magnolia tree that Margaret once loved. The blossoms fell like memories, slow, steady, beautiful even in their descent. In the soft soil below, new sunflowers had begun to push through, a promise of warmth ahead. She reached down, brushing a speck of dirt off her apron. It had been nearly a year since that day. The day Charles collapsed, the day she acted on instinct and grief and training, and saved the man who once saw her as less than a person. And what a year it had been! The Parker mansion no longer felt like a cold museum. Music flowed again through the halls, not from dusty records but from young students in the newly renovated music room. Laughter bounced off the walls, carried in by Amaya's friends, who now came every weekend for free tutoring and CPR workshops. Even the staff had changed, not in title, but in tone. Clara wasn't the maid anymore. She was Ms. Clara, the woman who saved a life and gave the house its soul back. Inside, the walls had begun to tell new stories. One photo in the main hallway caught the attention of most guests, a black and white image of a young Clara teaching CPR to a group of women, pinned beside a smiling Margaret with her hand raised like a proud student. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "Grace in action, the hands that heal." One morning, as Clara arranged freshly ironed linens, Charles approached her with a question. "Would you come with me?" he asked, softer now in his speech, the edge long gone from his voice. He led her to his late wife's favorite garden bench, newly restored and polished. He took a breath and gestured to the bronze plaque embedded in the stone. "In honor of Margaret and Clara, for teaching me that kindness isn't weakness." Clara's hand came to her mouth. For a moment, she couldn't speak. "She forgave me long before I deserved it," he continued. "And you gave me the chance to become someone she would have been proud of." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but they were gentle ones. Not bitter. Not tired. Just full. "You've changed, Charles." And that's what she wanted. Later that month, the Margaret Parker Foundation held its first annual gala in the mansion's ballroom, now transformed into a place of gathering and growth. The chandeliers sparkled not just with light, but with hope. Charles took the stage with Clara by his side. Guests applauded, not out of formality, but respect. "My wife loved music and compassion in equal measure," he began. "And thanks to Clara, someone I wronged more than once, I've learned to love both again." He turned to Clara. "Would you say a few words?" Clara stepped to the podium, hands steady. "I never asked to be seen," she said gently. "But I always hoped to be heard. This house, this family, it taught me that sometimes healing doesn't come from medicine alone. It comes from listening, forgiving, and showing up when it matters most. That day in the study, I didn't think. I just remembered. I remembered what it felt like to lose someone, and I couldn't let it happen again." Her voice caught, just slightly, before she smiled. "And now, watching these children learn to save lives, I know. I didn't just save one man that day. I helped restart something bigger. Something lasting." The applause was quiet at first. Then it grew, full and standing. After the event, Amaya curled up next to Clara on the old porch swing. "Do you miss Grandpa?" she asked suddenly. Clara looked up at the night sky. The stars were faint, but steady. "Every day," she whispered. "But I see him in moments like these. In your eyes. In that music room. In the lives we're touching now." Amaya reached into her coat and handed her grandmother a folded piece of paper. It was a school essay titled, "The Woman Who Saved More Than One Life." At the end, Amaya had written, "My grandma Clara didn't wear a cape. She wore an apron. But she's my hero. Because she didn't just teach people how to save lives, she reminded us all what a life worth living really looks like." Clara folded the essay gently, her hands shaking just a little. She tucked it into the same box that held her late husband's letters, the certificate from her CPR training, and now, this newest memory. That night, she sat by her window, wrapped in a soft shawl Margaret once gifted her long ago. Outside, the garden lights glowed like fireflies. Inside, Clara finally allowed herself to rest. Her journey, the quiet, powerful kind, had not only come full circle. It had bloomed. Speech Balloon, did this story speak to you? Please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Thumbs up like if Clara's strength touched your heart. Bell subscribe for more stories that celebrate quiet courage, deep kindness, and the power of second chances.